And then now I guess that brings us to the NIL and the paying of players. Because, again, you're right. I said this to start the show. This is the kimono being lifted, the complete professionalism of collegiate athletics, amateurism, however you want to put it. And that appears to be schools and school presidents and television networks. They got the whole realignment thing down pat. They got this thing handled. They know how to strike that deal. Paying the players, I mean, ever since NIL came into being 2 years ago, there still isn't any rules. And whatever's on the books statewide, I mean, you even heard Greg Sankey of the SEC say it in his opening address at the SEC Media Week. You know, state laws are not enforced. They don't know of a single state law that's been enforced. And then the NCAA is telling programs, yeah, your state laws don't even exist as far as we're concerned. My coach, if I boil it down, a couple of hamburgers to some kids, he might miss 4 games. I mean, the whole benefits and paying of players, I don't know how the hell we're ever going to come to an agreement on that. I will now leave you to answer that based on this past weekend's events, Jay.
Well, I hate to boil it down to this, but it's really easy, Rich. Right now, the administrators and coaches are complaining about 2 things. They're complaining about NIL because they don't know what the market is, and they don't know what they can and cannot do. And the truth is they can do just about whatever they want to do, which I think is the way it should be. I think it should be deregulated. And then they're worried about retention, the transfer portal. So they want players to have to declare where they're going and be locked in because it helps their roster. They like to use the red herring of what happened to commitment and loyalty and all that stuff when, hey, man, the transfer portal for schools is wide open.
Yeah.
Schools they're transferring left and right to whatever conference they want, but then they want to turn around out of the other side of their mouths and say, but players shouldn't have to be allowed movement. But here's the easy fix to all this. The NCAA needs to stop with this amateurism nonsense. That's dead anyway. They moved the goalposts, to use a sports metaphor. They moved the goalposts to employment. Now they can't be employees. Drop all that nonsense and just let the schools sign players to contracts. And that way you can sign a player to a 3-year deal. If you want to have a buyout if the player leaves or whatever, goes pro, you can do that. You can have contract conditions. Everybody knows what the market is, and they know how they're competing. It's incredible how contracts work for literally everyone else in America except college athletes. They could do that in a heartbeat, and there'd be some cost certainty and retention in there, and they wouldn't have to worry about this transfer portal, and they wouldn't have to worry about NIL. You sign a player to a contract just like you and I sign a contract with our media companies, and we would negotiate, and they would be able to tell us whether we could do commercials outside of it and what commercials we could do. You pay for that right in the employment contract. Really simple. If you get arrested, they can terminate. Morals clause, they can terminate. There's all kinds of contract conditions. And then there are contract remedies through the court systems. It's really pretty simple.
And what about going to school?
It works for the rest of the American business community. It would work really well for college athletes, but it's just a line that they don't want to cross because they don't feel like it. And in the meantime, they're going to beg Congress for an antitrust exemption. They're continuing to do that. And they're prosecuting, they're having to deal with these court cases. And the latest one is going to be the crusher if they can't be successful in the NCAA. And I think they're going to have a hard time because they're going up against Jeffrey Kessler, the guy that handed them their rear end in the last case before the U.S. Supreme Court.
Just 2 questions to ask you, and then we'll wrap this thing up. You mentioned Jeffrey Kessler. NFL fans know of his name because he was part of the collective bargaining during the lockout. And, man, did the NFL owners not like him at all. And the league didn't want him in the room at all. He is a bulldog, to say the least. Does that mean players are going to unionize? Is that what that means? I mean, because is that the inevitable aspect that college players must join athletes must join a union, and everything has contracts? Softball, lacrosse, hockey, it's all contracted players. Jay?
Yeah, they don't need a union because all these different employees don't necessarily have a union. And a union specifically may be difficult because we're dealing with public and private institutions. So there are some legal hurdles there.
Mm-hmm.
They could certainly have a trade association, somebody that the NCAA or individual conferences could bargain with, so that they have a more collective bargaining type of environment, and that may be helpful overall. But whether the players decide to organize so that they can speak more with one voice in negotiation with management, that's all fine, because that's agreed to between players and management that way. If they decide to do that, that's fine. If the NCAA finds that easier, it's all good. Because people sometimes will say, hey, they have salary, like you just can't pay a player anything you want. They have salary caps in the NFL or the NBA. Well, that's true, but those are collectively bargained, and the players get around 50% of revenue in each of those things. So when these schools talk about how expensive it's going to be, they want to give 50% of revenue to the players. They'll find out what expensive looks like. That's expensive. Right now, the players are cheap. Even the highest paid players in college, due to NIL and these collectives, are cheap relative to the amount of money that the enterprise makes. And that's why they would say, well, we don't need 27 staff members. Let's put the money on the floor, on the field, things like that. And things would be a lot more sane.
Well, and then that's the last part is the going to school part. If we have now reached a part, or we have a long time ago, but now we are just flat out acknowledging that a full ride scholarship is not even remotely commensurate to an athlete's value, and or remotely commensurate to the revenue that's being brought in collectively by the athletes performing, then what about going to school? Does that go away too, and we just play for a school?
No,
what do we got?
I mean, this is where the NCAA. This is in the NCAA's wheelhouse, and this is where regulation is fine. I think as a baseline principle of being a college athlete, it's fine for the NCAA to say a condition upon this money being a part of the enterprise, playing, whatever, is you have to be a full-time student in good standing. That's not that big of a deal. That's really the only thing that is separating the NFL and the NBA and Major League Baseball, whatever, from college sports, is the requirement that the players be enrolled in school. And, they've used the term student athlete all these years, and we don't want to get into why that came up, but it's really a phony construct. I mean, all you have to do to be a student is be enrolled. But enrolled and in good standing, and they can have some reasonable regulation around that. That's not that big of a deal. And if they can send their tutors on their 10-game road trips and all that stuff, but there's clearly going to be a lot more on the road. And then each individual school can make a decision: do we want to do this or not? One thing I say to all these administrators that complain when they say this is getting out of hand, this is not what this is supposed to be about. And I said, well, if you want to play. If you want to play in Division II or Division III, it's wide open. Remember years ago, and I love him. He was the best ever. Jim Delaney still is,
sure.
But he's retired now.
Big Ten.
When they talked about paying the players, Jim said, the Big Ten may go Division II if that happens. And I couldn't respect anybody more than him, but I couldn't help but snicker because I knew it was a phony threat. Like, does anybody really think that Ohio State is going to play Amherst at the Shoe on Saturday with no television and free admission? Like, that's not going to happen. None of these schools are leaving this enterprise. They need it too much. And I don't want to say they're addicted to the money, because they're not, but they're chasing the money just like any of us would. There's nothing wrong with what the NCAA schools are doing here. I think it's fine. And each school, their alums and their supporters can say what they like it or not, and they can make their individual decisions on how to handle this. Where it becomes hypocritical is when they say, we are going to act this way in the marketplace, but we are going to restrict only one class of person in their earnings, and that's the player. That's where this becomes, in my judgment, wrong to the point of being immoral.
Catch the Rich Eisen Show every single day on the Roku channel, 12 to 3 Eastern, for free.